All right, y'all, you're Locked On Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today I will be joined by Jeff Schultz, who covers Atlanta sports for The Athletic, and today we'll be talking about why it took so long for the Falcons to trade Deion Jones, why we continue to have the conversation about the Falcons quarterback situation, and despite a disappointing end to Week 5 for the Falcons, why this team is on the path for having a successful 2022.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, and, of course, the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline is where the game starts. And so, guys, we'll be joined later in today's episode by Jeff Schultz of The Athletic to talk about the Deion Jones trade. We'll get Jeff's thoughts on it. If you missed my thoughts on it, I already talked about it, so you won't hear much of my thoughts on it. Guys, you got to make Locked On Falcons your first listen, because if you didn't, you missed the 3 shows we did on Sunday. We did the postcast for Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. Then we did the rapid reaction, and we did an emergency pod where I reacted to the Deion Jones trade. So if you have made Locked On Falcons your first listen, whether today's episode or yesterday's episodes, one of those can be your first listen, one of them could be your second listen. Of course, free and available on a variety of platforms like Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course YouTube. Make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, give us a like, all that and more. So without further ado, let's jump into the conversation with Jeff Schultz, talking about the Deion Jones trade as well as the Falcons Week 5 loss. All right, everyone, you are Locked On Falcons, and today I am joined by another illustrious guest, none other than Jeff Schultz, who covers all of Atlanta sports over at The Athletic. And today, Jeff is joining us to talk a little bit about the Falcons' Week 5 loss to the Bucs, talk about the season. We'll talk about the quarterback conversation, but of course, if we're talking to Jeff, we got to talk about Deion Jones. He's been one of the people out there writing about how the Falcons have been poised to move on from Deion Jones for months now. And it finally happened Sunday evening after the Falcons Week 5 loss to the Bucs, in which they traded him to Cleveland for swapping a pair of late 2024 round picks. But Jeff, thoughts on the Deion Jones trade finally happening that you, myself, and other people have been talking about for months now?
Yeah, I'm so glad we don't have to have this conversation again after this podcast, because like you said, we have been talking about it. When I first wrote it in late May, I think, I don't know if I actually had the word imminent in the story, but I know I had the word imminent in the headline, because I knew at that time that the important people in the building, let's just say that, were not fans of Deion Jones. And you know, to say this was just a money issue is short-sighted and just ignores the obvious, which was that he had not become a very good player in the last couple of years. And even above that, Aaron, he was not a great guy that you want in a rebuild. In other words, if he had kind of settled at the level of being just an average player, overpaid, obviously, but an average player, then but he brought something else to the table, some other intangible: leadership, work ethic, showing other guys how it was done, and just playing hard and trying hard. I think they would have kept him for another year, because the truth of the matter is, it would have been easier cap-wise to do so for next year. He'd be off the books after this year, but I think at this point his presence was a detriment, and so they tried to get rid of him really throughout the offseason. And then I think as we neared in training camp, and as we were sort of going through training camp, I think what happened was they didn't want Deion Jones to almost have freedom of movement. In other words, there was probably this part of, screw it, we can't trade him, we're just going to cut him, right? I think that's what some of us thought. I kind of thought that for a while. And I think they thought, no, you know what? Because he might just go to the Saints right down the street. And, like, it wouldn't shock me if Deion sort of tries to ball out here in Cleveland, right? I think he's, he could get kind of a second life and play hard. That's what happens a lot of times when veterans get cut, they get stung, they get humbled a little bit. And I could totally see him going to a team like the Saints, where he grew up, and play real hard, particularly playing against the Falcons a couple times a year. But they didn't want that. So they basically went down this road. I don't want to make any judgments here on whether he actually has been hurt these last 4 weeks or not. But I mean, the Falcons all along have been very mysterious about the surgery that he had, and him going on the PUP list and him going on the injured list and all this stuff. And it was clear, put it this way, it was clear to me, and I think to you, he was never going to play for them again. The question is, what was the resolution going to be? And we finally have a resolution. And it wasn't about the draft pick getting back. It was just about getting him out of the building and getting him off the books as much as possible for next year.
Okay. Now, this is not a Aaron Freeman question. This is a question from listeners, because I've gotten some feedback already on this trade of the Falcons. As you mentioned, basically did not get really anything substantial in return for him. Right. What do you sort of say to those people that are upset that the Falcons, got pennies on the dollar, so to speak?
Well, I mean, the market is the market, right? So they got, was it a second round draft pick for Julio Jones? I think, right? That was honestly way more than they should have gotten. It's just a matter of, is there a team out there that really wants to pay a price for a guy? There was no team out there who wanted to pay anything for Deion Jones. So if you want to look at his resume and say, oh, he had a great rookie year, and then he went to the Pro Bowl and this and that, and he was a centerpiece, blah, 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 that's fine. I'm just telling you that most people looked at his film and looked at him, the person, and said, we're not paying for this guy. And they knew and the other situations, they knew the Falcons were stuck to some degree. They knew the Falcons didn't want to keep him. In fact, to even get the Browns interested, or any team interested in taking him now, what did the Falcons have to do 3 weeks ago? They had to restructure the contract and eat more money. They took some of the money he was guaranteed. They moved it to him up front, which effectively lowered his salary this year, which made him easier to trade. So not only people want to complain the Falcons didn't effectively get anything for him, they only got what they got because they ate more salary a few weeks ago. So, there's a tendency in sports sometimes for fans to say, Matt Ryan, greatest quarterback in Falcons history. Julio Jones, greatest quarterback in Falcons history. Deion Jones, Pro Bowler, blah, blah. Well, that's all yesterday. Okay. We're dealing with today and a guy's market value, and the guy had no market value. So that's my response.
Okay. Well, we will move on from the Deion Jones conversation.
Thank you.
5-month-old conversation on today's Locked On Falcons here with Jeff Schultz of The Athletic. And we'll talk a little bit about the Falcons' Week 5 loss to the Buccaneers, gets Jeff's thoughts on that, as well as kind of talk a little bit about, are the Falcons having a semi-successful season based off of the parameters that Jeff and I talked about at the start of the season. We'll get Jeff's thoughts on that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So, of course, guys, we got more to come on today's episode, and we're at a point in the season and really the time of year in the calendar where we're all trying to be comfortable. And one of the places that you like to be comfortable is down below, and you need an underwear that can handle everything, which means it's time for Tommy John underwear. Tommy John's breathable, lightweight fabric has 4 times the stretch of competing brands, and they come with a no wedgie guarantee. Plus, they feature a horizontal quick draw fly for you when you need that quick access when nature calls. With 17 million pairs sold, people love Tommy John underwear. I love them too. I love anybody who takes care of the goods. So take care of your goods and go to TommyJohn.com/locked-on right now, and you'll get 20% off your first order. That's 20% off at TommyJohn.com/locked-on, LOCKEDON. TommyJohn.com/locked-on. See site for details. So here with Jeff Schultz of The Athletic, and we're going to talk about this Falcons Week 5 loss to the Bucs coming up. But guys, I do want to thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen. And of course, there's your second listen. Check out Locked On NFL all week long. Get those predictions all week long in terms of the great coverage that they provide for the upcoming Week 6 matchups, as well as recapping the Week 5 games. But Jeff, talking about recapping Week 5 games, I know you did not watch the Falcons Bucs game live, but obviously everybody is talking about the blown call at the end of the game. So share your thoughts on that and anything else that you observed from Sunday's matchup.
I mean, it was a horrendous call, and I told you just before we went on the air here that I watched the replay, I think 5, maybe 6 times, looking for specific things. Okay, what could the referee have been thinking? Could it have been he stepped on him? Could it have been he rolled him and slammed into the ground? Could it have been he dropped an elbow on him? He laid on him? You go through all those things, and there was none of that there. It was a bad call by a referee who has been an official who has been called out before for bad calls. And I think he had a bad roughing the passer call recently in a Ravens game. And so this is not a first. But we've all seen bad calls. I have not seen, but it's bad. 2 things. I have 2 thoughts. One was it's bad because it potentially decided the game, right? If it's 21-0 at the time of the call, it's a bad call. Everybody's upset. But the Falcons theoretically would have got the ball back with 2.5 minutes left. And they would have had to drive the field, which would have been a challenge. But still, they had an opportunity to win the game. The other thing is, and I noticed it last night on social media. I was on Twitter a little bit last night. I retweeted a few comments on it, and I certainly noticed it this morning. I have never seen, I don't think, a bad call in a regular season game, certainly for something other than was it a catch or not a catch, resonate like this nationally. I mean, ESPN was all over it. I mean, I heard Dwight Free on the radio. He was all over it. And that's what kind of makes me wonder if the NFL is going to do anything. And by doing anything, I'm not talking about demoting Jerome Boger, down and only giving him the lousy games or something like that. I'm talking about saying something publicly, because as a general rule, they don't do that. Okay. The NBA has this thing where they give you what's it called, the final 2-minute report on NBA officiating. Now, granted, that was somewhat pushed after they had a gambling scandal with a former official. But as a general rule, and Major League Baseball sometimes will come out with a statement on a disputed umpire's decision, whatever. But as a general rule, the NFL doesn't do anything. They just kind of wait for the noise to go away. And if they're going to apologize or say something to a team, they're going to do so very quietly and privately. It's not going to be a public statement. So, but because you have business partners like ESPN getting involved here, I'm very curious to see what happens. And look, this is Grady Jarrett, okay? We're not talking to we're not talking to Ndamukong Suh, okay? A player who had a resume at one point of just being a dirty player. This is one of the cleanest, toughest, but clean players and most respected players in the NFL. And then you have the whole, somebody called me this morning and we were talking about it. And I asked him, I said, could something like this happen just because it's Tom Brady? And the person said, yeah, possibly. They weren't putting it all on the fact that it was Tom Brady, but that can play into some thinking too. So it's a bad call. It's unfortunate that, again, there's no guarantee the Falcons would have come back to win the game, but you want to give them the opportunity, and you don't want to see something like that taken away by just a terrible decision.
Fair enough. Yeah. Any other thoughts on the Falcons' performance from?
Well, I mean, when it was 21-0, because I was monitoring the score during the day. I thought that's kind of what I expected. I mean, I didn't think the Bucs were that good. They're not that good of a team right now, but let's face it, the Falcons don't have many offensive weapons, as you know, and 2 of them were out. Okay. They're without Kyle Pitts and Cordero Patterson. And who's left? Drake London. And then they're really young in the backfield. So I was somewhat, I guess I wasn't surprised at 21-0, but I was somewhat heartened, I guess you can say, and I continue to be impressed with how hard this team plays. You're down 21-0 at Tampa Bay. We've seen this game before, Aaron. We've seen how this thing ends. It probably ends 30-6 or something, or whatever. It doesn't end 21-15 with potentially the Falcons having a chance to win the game, especially on the road. And so I thought that was really impressive. Marcus Mariota, I know you may want to talk about him a little bit, but guys are playing hard. The offensive line is playing hard. You have some guys running the ball well. They made a running game work out. It ran for 151 yards yesterday with Tyler Algier and Caleb Huntley and Mariota. So, I mean, that's pretty damn impressive, you know. If you could keep better teams close, even if you lose the game, which is what they're doing, I think that's impressive. That's my initial thoughts.
Okay. I think those are fair thoughts. I had similar sentiments on yesterday's rapid reaction at the end of that episode. So that is a perfect kind of bridge into the conversation I want to continue with you, going back to what we talked about at the beginning of the season, asking you sort of what's a successful season look like for this Falcon football team. And I'm just curious if you think so far, again, we're obviously only 5 games into the season, if it is a successful year for the Falcons. We'll talk about that, as well as talk a little bit more about Marcus Mariota and Desmond Ridder to close out today's episode here with Jeff Schultz of The Athletic. Guys, got to talk about the number one source for all your football betting needs and info this season. And of course, we're talking about BetOnline.net. From the latest player developments, matchups, news, podcasts, in-depth articles, and analysis for every game, including this upcoming weekend's games. The Falcons are 5.5-point underdogs at home against this 49ers team the Falcons have covered 5 weeks in a row. Can they make it 6? Can they make it 6? I'm feeling good. I'm feeling good. Are you feeling good? If you are, head on over to BetOnline, your number one source for all your sports wagering information, whether it's live in-game betting or you want up-to-minute scores for every sport out there, not only football, MLB, NBA, MMA, boxing, golf, college football, so much more. Head to the website today at betonline.net. Use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. So we are continuing to wrap up today's episode here on Locked On Falcons. And of course, if you happen to have Amazon Fire TV or Roku, you can check out Locked On Falcons, as well as other Locked On at Atlanta shows with the Locked On Sports Atlanta app on those platforms. So download Locked On Sports Atlanta app on Roku or Amazon Fire TV to check out more local sports team coverage. Continuing here with Jeff Schultz of The Athletic, and talking about a successful season, going back to that conversation at the beginning of September before the start of the regular season, had Jeff on, as well as Scott Bear of the AtlantaFalcons.com, talking about how do we measure a successful season, not necessarily focus on wins and losses, although Jeff, you kind of indicated in that episode that you felt like this team was probably going to win somewhere between 5 and 7 games. It feels like that they're definitely on that path potentially. And ask you the question about, is it more about, checking boxes, or is the term I use, to see how many of these pieces that the Falcons have are, potentially long-term pieces that if and when this team has a windfall of cap space in the very near future after the season, and they can start, spending money and getting better assets, whether or not this team will be in a position to be contending potentially for postseason play sooner versus later. And from my perspective, based off of the first 5 games, it does feel like this team is kind of checking some of those boxes. I'm curious, where do you sort of land on that issue?
Yeah, I mean, I've already touched on the effort, which I think has been very impressive. That that shows you, particularly in games like Sundays, that not only are they granted playing for their jobs, because a lot of them are on short-term deals, but I think it shows that the coaching staff has their attention. And I think that's really important, particularly in tough times. So I think that's a box. I think that's a box that you check for the coaches, and I think it's a box you check for the players they've chosen. And along with that, I haven't really noticed anybody who's pulled the chute, okay, who just is playing like they don't want to be here. With the exception of the guy maybe they just traded. Okay. So see, I knew I'd come back. I don't know why I didn't want to come back to Deion Jones again, and it just happened. Sorry. I think the next is, and again, so much obviously depends on health in terms of how much you're going to be able to win. They can't play that many games this year without CP and without Kyle Pitts. They just can't do it. Because as much as you almost theoretically could have ground out a win yesterday, I just don't know how often that's going to be able to happen, particularly late in the season, when teams, generally the good teams, get a lot better. It's tougher to win. It's tougher to win in cold weather. So I think at this point, and I know we're going to veer to this, we're going to start to get close, I think, to that Mariota Desmond Ridder decision here. These next two games, I think most people before the season would write down as losses, right? 49ers and at Bengals. And even though Cincinnati's not that great, they still are roster-wise miles ahead of the Falcons. The 49ers have lost their quarterback, but their backup quarterback has won a lot of games in this league. And so I think most people would view those as losses. If that's what happens and they're 2-5, unfortunately their bye is really late this year. But after the Cincinnati game, you play Carolina twice, you play the Bears, you play Washington, you play the Chargers. You have some winnable games in there, right? And I think with Ridder, it's important that if you are going to put him in, you put him in games where he's theoretically not going to get destroyed. So I guess as we're sitting here today taping this, it's my sincere hope he is playing in some of these games, if not starting, at least playing. And I think he will if Arthur Smith thinks he's ready to play. In other words, there are a lot of things we don't really know because, unfortunately, the media only gets to see like 30 minutes of practice, maybe, or less than that. And it's often in certain parts of practice that they don't show anything. Yes, that is by design. And so, so we don't see if Desmond Ridder is missing a lot of throws or missing checks or whatever, or throwing to the wrong guy. Those things you can see in training camp because a lot of training camp practices are open. And Desmond Ridder was missing a lot of guys and some throws in training camp, and it was reported at that time. But I don't see a scenario where Desmond Ridder is ready to play and Arthur Smith thinks, no, we're not playing you yet. I just don't see that. Because it's not like Mariota is playing so great now. He's kind of holding things together a little bit, but it's not like he's playing so great now that he can't be beat out of the starting job, right? I mean, would you agree with that?
Yeah.
So, but he's not panicking. He's made some really bad decisions. He's made some good throws and some good decisions, but he's made some bad throws and some bad decisions. And I mean, he's basically been Marcus Mariota. But he's been a great team guy. He's been a great guy for the situation. Everybody loves him. He's been exactly what the Falcons wanted and Arthur Smith wanted when he brought him here. But there's a ceiling there. Let's just be real. He's only as good as he is. And at some point, they have to find out what they have in their third round draft pick. And when I asked that question to Arthur Smith before the season, how many games do you think you need to see him play to get a fair evaluation? Of course, Arthur took the question one way. And by the way, I don't know if we spoke about this on your podcast before. We did. Okay. So he and I are fine. We were laughing about it after the press conference, just to reiterate. But I knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew exactly what I was doing. He doesn't want to answer the question that's going to lead to the question that's going to lead to the question. But I have to ask the question. But he doesn't want to open that. Yeah, he doesn't want to open that door. And I get that. But I do think they need to see him X number of games before they make the determination about where they stand with their quarterback situation, to know whether they either draft one after this year or trade for one again or sign one again after this year. You can't go through the season without finding out. And to me, unless you're in a playoff race somehow, it doesn't make sense to wait to the last 2 or 3 games of the season. That would be bad. I think that's almost, I think to me, that almost makes it harder on Desmond Ridder to have success late in the season. I don't know offhand who they play late in the season, but it's tougher to win games sometimes late in the year than it is in the middle of the year when things are still sort of settling out. So that's my expanded viewpoint, I guess.
All right. Well, the last 4 teams after the bye are the Saints, the Ravens, the Cardinals, and the Bucs. So
okay, so maybe by then the Bucs have figured things out. The Ravens certainly are good. The Saints, who knows at this point? Cardinals, who knows at this point? But yeah, we'll see. We'll see what happens. Again, I would hope these next 4 to 6 weeks he's in there.
Yeah, well, this conversation's not going away because it's the quarterback,
right?
And it's the most important position. It's the biggest question you got to ask for this football team and the direction of this football team. A lot of people have been saying, Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot ultimately will be judged based off of their ability to find, the long-term replacement for Matt Ryan. And, I'm sure there are a handful of people listening and watching right now that would disagree with the statement I'm about to make, but I think it's at least pretty clear, unless Mariota really turns things around in the next week or two, that he's not that answer. And so now the conversation becomes, is Desmond Ridder that answer? And if not him, then who is? And so the only way you're going to be able to determine that is by seeing him on the football field. And as you mentioned, the practices weren't great in training camp, but he looked pretty good in the preseason games. Obviously, it wasn't perfect, but looked a lot more impressive in those games. And so part of you kind of wonders, maybe put him in some of these upcoming games, and maybe he'll look similarly impressive. So it's certainly a conversation that, much to the chagrin of some of the people watching and listening right now, will continue as things, and basically, unless Marcus Mariota starts playing lights out, it's going to continue to come up.
Yeah, again, I just come back to, a guy has a resume. Okay, the expression is, just look at the back of the baseball card. Obviously, this is football, but it's the same thing. Look at the back of a football card, and we're not looking at his Oregon resume. We're looking at his NFL resume. He is what he is. There are some things he does well. There are some things he doesn't do well. He has been, I think, what the Falcons thought he would be. But I strongly don't think they brought him in here with the expectation that he was going to be their quarterback of the future. I just don't. I think they brought him in here with the idea that he would be a good team guy. He would hold things together as much as possible until Desmond Ridder was ready to play, and then they can see what they have in Desmond Ridder. And I think the question now becomes, when is Desmond Ridder ready to play? But I certainly don't see a scenario where Marcus Mariota starts 17 games this year. I just don't. I would be surprised, but I've been surprised before, obviously. But I would be really surprised, John.
Was one of those surprises taking 5 months for Deion Jones to get traded?
A little bit, yeah. I guess the extent to which it turned out he was toxic surprised me a little bit, because in this league, he's still a young guy. He's still athletic, and he did make a Pro Bowl, and he had at least 2 good years. What his 3rd year, he got injured, and he was never quite the same after that. Not because of physically, but I think the contract and everything else. But I think in this league, when you have similar situations, there are a lot of coaches and front offices who think, I'll take that guy. We can get something out of him. He's okay. It's not like he's 32 or something and coming off knee surgery. I'll take that guy. But the NFL is still a hard place to make trades. All right. Because you have a cap issue. It's not like some other leagues. You have a really hard cap issue. And generally speaking, the Julio Jones trade maybe being an exception. Once in a while, there's exceptions. You don't see a lot of trades where teams really get what you would view as value for a player in trade. You just don't see it, because most trades happen when you're trying to get rid of a guy and when you have to get rid of a guy for cap issues or some other reason. And you can only pay so many guys, and rosters are set. You just don't see a lot of movement in the NFL. But yeah, it did go longer than I thought. I'll say that.
Ditto. Yeah. So it makes 2 of us. But Jeff, really appreciate you joining me, sharing your insights onto some of these subjects. Let the people know, what you got going on at the Athletic. I know you're neck deep in Braves baseball and other things going on, but go ahead and plug your stuff.
Yeah. Just go to theathletic.com, and you can go to the Atlanta page or my writer page. It will be a lot of Brave stuff right now. I will be circling back to the Falcons here as soon as possible. But I guess I'll circle back to them right after the Braves have played their last game anyway. That's as definite as I can make it right now.
Okay. So for a lot of Braves fans, they hope that is a very long time.
Yes, exactly.
So your next appearance on this podcast hopefully will be mini.
Yeah, second week of November.
Yeah, maybe.
Whatever,
yeah. We'll mark the calendar. Yeah. But Jeff, again, really appreciate you joining me on today's episode. And guys, go check out The Athletic and his Braves coverage. And of course, that's also check out Locked On Braves as well. If if Jeff isn't doing it enough for you, they got you covered as well there. But guys, really appreciate it. So, guys, that's it. Thank Jeff Schultz for joining me on today's episode. And tomorrow's episode, of course, will be our Week 5 All 22 review and mailbag that will allow you guys to sort of control the conversation. How do I break down the film, right? I already know I'm going to be focused on the defense. I'm also know I'm going to probably paying attention to how many of those 2-man route concepts, on offense. And we'll get into that. But if you have any other insights, any other questions that you have that you want me to pay attention to on film, of course, submit your questions Monday evening, Tuesday morning, as early as possible via Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons, via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com. Leave a comment on Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, or you can jump into Discord at Locked On Falcons, link in the description below. Again, just basically wherever you are right now, if you just search Locked On Falcons on your phone or whatever device you're holding, I'm sure you'll be able to find a way to get at me. So we will discuss the film on tomorrow's episode. And then, of course, later in the week, we will pivot towards the upcoming Week 6 matchup against the 49ers. See if the Falcons can cover that 5.5 point spread. So, guys, really appreciate it. Appreciate Jeff. Thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. And for your second listen, check out Peacock and Williamson. Check out Locked On Fantasy Football, all the other great shows here on the Locked On Sports Network. And, of course, you also want to check out Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Braves, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Sports Atlanta, ATL Day Ones, A to Z with Mark Zeno, Hitting Hard with John Jackery, all of those shows, again, for your second, third, fourth, fifth listens. I know you got so many shows you got to get through each and every day. But again, we always thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. Guys, really appreciate it. See you tomorrow when we break down the film. Till then.